So, I'm going to be doing a little bit of talking this evening about something that I call the Iron Pillar, which I'm going to go ahead and say is basically the Iron Pentacle, from Reclaiming Witchcraft, with a couple of small changes. So if you're familiar with the Iron Pentacle, I can mostly skip this. The reason why I want to go over this is because I have begun using it in my version of the LBRP, and it's been incredibly effective. And I think that it is something that reclaiming does better than ceremonial magic or grimoire tradition stuff does. And I think that it would behoove all of us to give it a shot. I'm not saying it's going to work for everybody. I'm not going to say that the Iron Pillar is better than the Iron Pentacle. I'm just going to say this is what works for me. So if you wind up watching a video where I perform my latest attempt at the LBRP or a full-on ritual, then you're going to want to kind of know what this is, because otherwise it just looks like a very strange waving around of hands, when actually it is something that it's an incredibly deep part of my magic. So let's get started. Before I actually go over what this thing is, for the complete newbies in the house, we're going to go over some basic concepts, okay? And this, I think, even if you don't end up doing the Iron Pentacle stuff, is going to be very important to understanding how and why ceremonial magic does things the way that it does. And it's a part of ceremonial magic that has integrated itself very deeply into most modern witchcraft revival movements. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So the Iron Pentacle and Iron Pillar are what I call spiritual maps, right? Spiritual maps map spiritual concepts onto physical reality. There's three common kinds of maps you find in various systems influenced by this concept. One is a map of spiritual energy onto the human body. One is a map of spiritual forces onto ritual spaces. And one is a map of spiritual existence onto space. So the existence off of our planet. Here you see a fairly commonplace mapping of the 12 signs of the zodiac to different parts of the human body. What Iron Pillar and Iron Pentacle are spiritual body maps. And what we're going to be doing, or what I've been doing with this tool, and what many reclaiming witches have been doing with the Iron Pentacle, is mapping spiritual concepts onto the physical body. The way that this map is built is you meditate, you visualize, you do movements, sacred dances sometimes. You also do something called attunements, right? And we're going to go over what attunements are a little later in the video. Now let's go over it now. Attunements are when you do a ritual or a set aside a part of time to pick one of the spiritual forces or values that's part of your spiritual map, and you attune to it, right? So you build an altar to it, you do things connected with that thing, you try and integrate it more into your daily life, you do a lot of journaling, right? And different people do attunements different ways. Some people do attunements that involve diets. Some people don't. Some people do attunements that involve playlists. I do that. It works very well for me. Some people don't do that. But typically, whenever you're working with a spiritual map, it's very common to do attunements to one attunement for each force. I've seen people do this over the course of 6 months, 1 weekend, a couple of years. It really depends on, are you working alone? How much safety training do you have? How much time do you have? And what attunements work for you? I will say, regardless of how you do your attunements, spiritual body maps take years to develop, because the longer that you work a spiritual body map and the more you commit to it, the more it will sink into your subconscious mind, and the more it will affect the way that you experience even your emotions in your body. Spiritual body maps can be standardized or individual. Obviously, I'm kind of halfway between the two, because the Iron Pillar is based on the Iron Pentacle. I do Iron Pentacle work in reclaiming communities. I just have a tendency to visualize it a little bit differently than how people are describing. One of the benefits of the spiritual body map is that because it tends to begin and end with slow, deep breaths, and because it does bring our attention to various parts of our body, like which muscles are tense, what feels hot, what feels cold, etc., etc., it does help with emotional regulation, and it helps with us to answer the question, like, where is this emotion sitting in my body right now, right? So there's lots of benefits to having a spiritual body map. I don't think there's anything wrong with spending a few years going around, sort of looking at different body maps that are open to you and that are appropriate for your circumstances. Before settling on one, I will say there are advantages to settling on one and then working it for several years. Oh, I put attunements right here. Okay, but yes, initial attunements will likely be one session per point of force value. Attunement sessions take different forms. You should take your time with them. You should also not be afraid to come back to them. One thing that I've seen practitioners experience, almost all of them, is something called the fallow period, where you don't feel particularly inspired to do things for your spirituality, or you feel like you've lost contact, or there's something that's not there anymore and you're just going through a rest phase. Fallow periods are a great time to do attunements because it kind of helps build the spiritual muscles so that when your fallow period is over, and they do end, for the record, they're not permanent, you'll be more ready to face whatever engagement you have moving forward. I will say if you're able to take a class or study with a group, it helps a lot, just because attunements can sometimes cause changes in our lives. And when we are accountable to a community we can trust, these changes tend to be a lot healthier. I'm not saying that you have to work in a group. I understand a lot of people can't access groups or have a lot of trauma around spiritual groups, but there are benefits to taking that risk. So, spiritual body maps are generally used for something called centering. Now, a lot of people are have different opinions about what grounding and centering are. So I'm going to go ahead and say again, these are my personal beliefs. Grounding is something that returns us to our personal mental baseline, our mundane mind. So when I ground, I'm trying to return basically to my regular amount of anxiety, right? Like that slight amount of worry that I could die at any moment in the back of my head because I have clinical anxiety. That's just my baseline. Similarly, other people's baselines are not going to be the same, but getting back to that baseline, and if possible, maybe a little more regulated than what our normal day-to-day is, that's what grounding is supposed to do. And ideally, if you pick a grounding practice or practices that are really good for you, over time, your baseline should become like more steady, though for some people that's chemically impossible, right? Centering is something where you kind of check in with these spiritual attunements and it brings you to your spiritual center, and it tends to prepare us for ritual and prayer, right? Similarly, I've said this before and I'll say it again, I will beat this horse way past its demise. The more you practice it, it doesn't have to be regularly, but the more you practice it, the more your subconscious idea of what it means to be in your body will conform to the spiritual body map, right? The good news is that it means if you start up with a spiritual body map and you figure out like a couple of months in it doesn't work for you, you can change, right? It is possible to change or alter maps. It is recommended. I highly recommend that you, as always, journal what's going on in your life so that you can look out for problems. And also, if you understand the way that you've changed the map, you can more readily identify changes that you've made in your life that might be subconsciously being affected by the map you're using. So I'm going to go ahead and be honest here. Iron Pentacle is a practice that originated in the Anderson Fairy tradition. It was inherited by Reclaiming Witchcraft, which I believe was begun by a coven of witches who were, at least some of them were fairy initiates, right? If you've taken Elements of Magic or an equivalent class, which is basically things like understanding how to ground yourself, understanding how to cast a circle, understanding group ritual, a couple other things, you are more than welcome to go and sign up for an Iron Pentacle class. They're quite lovely. The pandemic hasn't quite ended yet, so I don't think any are being offered in person, but there may be some being offered online. There's also a couple of books that go over it if you'd like to go over, because I'm not always the best at talking about Iron Pentacle, so giving these books a onesie twosie, and I think there's a third one I forgot to mention here called Circling the Star. These will also help you get a better understanding of what the values are here and like the basic idea that's going on. I will also say that when Iron Pentacle was created, because Reclaiming is a leftish political tradition, One of the big things that was going on, at least in the reclaiming side of things, I don't know anything about fairy because I'm not initiated, uh, is this idea that we are reclaiming things back from the culture that we live in. And one of the things that I have found is that doing Iron Pentacle work, especially as someone who was expected to be a woman, that didn't happen, best laid plans of mice and men, there's a lot of codependency work that I ended up doing as soon as I started engaging in Iron Pentacle and facing some of the blocks that I would see in myself based on that work. So there are some things between Iron Pentacle and the Iron Pillar that I kept, right? So Iron Pentacle is supposed to acknowledge the iron in space, in various space bodies such as stars, and the iron in the earth. And it's supposed to help us bring some of that molten iron earth energy up into the human body. You will notice that there is a point called sex where your head is. There has been a discussion with the asexual witches of our communities as to how to like reframe, rethink, and potentially rename this point so that we still get the point across, but we don't use the word sex because it's not the most inclusive term. We haven't really come to a decision about it. I think mostly because we have some people who found workarounds and some people who are looking for workarounds, and there's not really a good word, and we'll get into why later. So if you're asexual, the things you should be looking for connected to sex point, if it's not going to work for you to think of it that way, is you're looking for something that has to do with ecstatic pleasure and it has to be a very warming concept, right? So when Iron Pentacle is run, traditionally, it's run one of two ways. One is to go inside the star, and this is typically the way that it's run. You go from sex in the head to pride in your right foot to self in your left hand to power in your right hand to passion in your left foot back to sex at your head. And the idea is that as you run the energy from that the earth has gifted you through your body, that you will locate blockages in these values and the way they sit in your body so that you can reclaim what it is to be right-sized, right? Like there is an amount of sex that is a good amount for each of us to have. For some people it's less, for some people it's more. There is an amount of pride that is good for us to have. For some people it's less, for some people it's more. There's very much a sense of like being right-sized is a very big theme in all of this. The other way to run it is around the outside. So sex goes from the head, goes to power in the right hand, goes to pride in the right foot, goes to passion in the left foot, goes to self in the left foot, goes back to sex the head. This is less common, and it's typically run this way after it's run the first way as part of people doing very deep work with this pentacle. If you want to try running it this way, you can feel free. This image is also from paysmith.com. Feel free to go and read their opinion about the Iron Pentacle and other people's opinion about the Iron Pentacle. I'm not going to lie, when I first heard about this, I was like, this is super woo and I'm not into it. And then I tried it for a while and I was like, oh, actually this works. Well, if it works, I'll do it. So there's a couple of differences. You're going to see this image a lot. It's a bad image. It's all I had the energy to make. The first is that instead of the different values being major energetic points in the body, they are movements between energetic points in the body and outer forces. The order is different. It goes sex, pride, self, power, passion, self, sex. We'll go over exactly what the movements are in a bit. The up-down axis between sky, earth, and like underworld is very particularly useful when you're working in folk Catholicism and grimoire magic because it sort of recenters the cosmology. And hopefully when we're doing this without moral judgments. I want to abandon this idea that the celestial world is better than the earthly world and that the earthly world is better than the underworld. I really want us to like let go of this idea because it's obviously a false moral judgment, right? So with that being said, let's get into the nitty-gritty of how I do the Iron Pillar. There are 3 main energy centers in the body. I'm going to be really honest. I have looked high and low for where I got this idea from. I know that it's at least influenced by Neoplatonism. I have no idea where I got this. If I figure it out, I will happily cite my sources. But I read a lot of stuff, so I'm sure I got it from somewhere. So the gut fire sits in the bowl of the pelvis. It's linked to digestion, sexuality, physical vitality, and a part of the 3-part soul that's sometimes called the fetch, the animal self, the child self, sticky one. I prefer to call it the fetch personally, but that's me. The second fire I want to talk about is the head fire, pretty self-explanatory. It sits in the bowl of the skull. It's associated with language, thought, cleverness, and our what's called talker self. You can also think of that, quite frankly, as the ego. You could think of gut fire as being very connected to the id. The heart fire is connected to, sits in the bowl of the rib cage. It's part connected to our emotions, our connection to other people, but also, and this is a topic that I'm going to go over in a future video or in a blog post, our sacred dove, our God self, our holy guardian angel, our ideal self, our higher self, however you want to think of that, our divine spark, those things. I will say that while you can kind of match the gut fire to the id and the head fire to the ego, you can't match the heart fire to the superego, because the superego in the id, ego, superego dynamic is very overly concerned with how society will perceive us. And I can frankly say that that's not something that gets carried into this model, and it's not useful for this model. So at that point, the Freudian tripartite self doesn't really become like relevant to this. But yeah. So in theory, we should be tending these 3 fires. They shouldn't run too hot or too cold. They need, things to eat, air to breathe, room to breathe, and also like a good sense of boundaries. If you let a fire run wild, it'll burn itself out and hurt things around it at the same time. One thing I will say is that we all have our own baselines for health. Like, I have a chronic gut illness. There is no amount of spiritual reworking of my gut fire that is going to fix it. It's just something I live with. It's part of my baseline. If you want to improve your baseline, I do recommend seeking out appropriate mental or physical health professionals. I understand that for some people, traditional medicine has been incredibly traumatizing, and if that's so, I truly hope that you find the kind of healer that is appropriate and correct for you. Allopathic medicine has worked alongside holistic medicine hand in hand for me for many years now, and so I partake in both because that's just the way my life is working. I will say that monitoring and stewarding your files, regardless of what your situation is still incredibly useful. And again, the point of a body map like this is to be able to check in and ask your stomach, like, how am I feeling today? Have I been eating things that are good for me and make me feel energized and ready to take on the day and like my best self? Or am I eating things that make me sluggish? Am I eating things that make me cranky? Am I not eating enough because of some kind of reason? Or if you're looking at the head fire, am I giving myself time to sleep? Because sleep is incredibly important for the brain and thoughts in general. Am I drinking enough water? Oddly, when it comes to the heart fire, am I expressing my emotions? Am I feeling my emotions? Am I using my adult words when I express my emotions? Or am I sitting in my emotions for too long? Or am I doing things about them? All of these the day-to-day common sense questions. Obviously, if something becomes like big enough of a problem, again, please seek an appropriate healing professional based on your situation. But these 3 fires are the fires in the body that the energy passes through when I do the iron pillar, and it's a way of honoring the Neoplatonism in the lineages that I work with, while also bringing in that reclaiming theme of the iron, and it's been working for me really well. So the first movement goes, if you remember the previous slide, goes from the fire in the gut down to the core of the earth, and the value associated with that movement of our energy is called sex, right? So again, reclaiming sex connects our gut fire to the molten core of the earth. Sex is the closest word we could define to describe where bodily pleasure leads to generation. Generation here does not refer only to the making of children, but also to art, the co-creation of relationships, and the creation of self-knowledge. Likewise, we expand our notion here of bodily pleasure from sexual erotic pleasure to other forms. Each of us has our own appropriate and healthy ways of experiencing the ecstatic pleasure which leads to generation. Also, if anyone has an idea for what the heck we could name this thing, please feel free to leave it in the comments, because again, I would love to run it by the rest of my community to see what we think of it. I would love to be more inclusive of asexual people if at all possible, and what have you. So the second movement is where we draw the energy that we are gifted by the earth into our body. And this movement is called pride. Healthy pride is really hard to find in our culture. We tend to have pride that's either rusted or gilded. Rusted is the way that we describe energies that are blocked or too small. People who are openly self-deprecating often have rusted pride. And then pride that's gilded is very much people who are talking themselves up, obviously, because they don't actually believe a word they're saying, but they want you to believe it, because maybe if they can convince you, they can convince themselves, right? Narcissists are an extreme example of gilded pride. But healthy pride is quiet, self-assured. It doesn't rest on the idea that you're perfect or never make a mistake. It rests on the idea that you're perfect, you make mistakes, and you are enough. You are lovable. You are human. You're pretty cool, right? So that's pride. Self, again, really complicated topic. The first time I touch on self, I am moving from the gut fire to the heart fire, because when I move energy into my chest, it has a tendency to strengthen my body. When I run it from my head, I get real dizzy. It doesn't work very well for me. But yeah, this topic's really complicated. I'm not going to go into it here, but ideas about reclaiming self have to do with like reclaiming your sense of self-worth from your productivity, reclaiming your sense of self from who you are as a consumer, reclaiming yourself as something that is mysterious and not easily quantified, right? So we'll leave it at that. Power goes from the head fire up towards the stars into space, toward the iron on other planets and in the heart of stars. Reclaiming power is partially also about shifting the way we think about power, obviously, because reclaiming is a bunch of hippy-dippy leftists. We think about power with and power within. We don't really think about power over. It's not about how many people you can force to do your bidding or how much of a bully you can be. It's about knowing what you can do and doing it. And I think not underestimating yourself is a big part of that. But I think for me personally, taking responsibility for the consequences of your actions and deciding to act, knowing that you might have to take responsibility for some impact and negative consequences, is also very tied into PowerPoint for me personally, and I think for other people as well. Passion is where we accept the energy of the celestial bodies back into our head fire. I think passion for me is the hardest one to speak about because it's the one that comes most easily for me. Reclaiming it asks us to co-create reality, and it also, I'm going to be really honest, I think this thing where we are expected to monetize our hobbies is part of an unhealthy way of looking at passions. I think that when we reclaim passion, we get a perspective on what we do to survive and what we're surviving for. But again, it's really hard for me to put my experience of the passion point into words. It's very much about inspiration and drive and a desire to be in the world and of the world, right? That's why, for me, passion definitely fits this idea of celestial energies falling down into the body. So, normally when I run Iron Pillar, for the first time, I spend a lot of time and several breaths on each movement, right? So I'll spend several breaths on sex, pride, sex, pride, sex, pride, sex, pride before doing a breath for self, and then power, passion, power, passion, power, passion, power, passion, the other breath for self, right? But I've been doing this for years now, so now when I'm doing it at the beginning of the LBRP, my first inhale, which is the movement of sex, the value of sex, I literally just take one inhale and I let my energy fall into the earth. I exhale, and I ask the earth to please permit me the gift of energy into my core. I take an inhale, and I accept that mysterious energy into the mystery of my own self. The second exhale rises up, is me exerting my power to lift up towards the stars. The third inhale, I accept the power the stars would gift me into the head fire. And then the third exhale and the final movement moves from head to heart. I'm sure this will wind up in a video at some point, and then you'll actually see it all move together. It's very fluid and very short, but it's all pretty important stuff, and it's a map that's not found in other places, so I think it's pretty important to go over the details. And that's the end. This video's longer than I expected it to be, but it's one of those things where the LBRP is so dense, and this is such a key part of the things I have done to like alter it that I felt it would be really necessary to sit down and go through it all. Again, there's plenty of things about Iron Pentacle around there. There are books, there are websites, there are probably other videos. There's Reclaiming Witches around. You can talk to them. They'll be able to talk about the reclamation of sex, pride, self, power, and passion way better than I can. I'm just here to say that you should have a spiritual map. You should understand where it comes from. You should understand adaptations you've made to it. You should work it on a regular basis. You should track whether or not it's helping you to use the spiritual map that you're using. Just really common sense things. And I hope to see you all back in the next one.